Hello, hello, internet land and magic people of the future. If you're watching this in the future. It's Sylph Dominic Hawkins here, coming to you live on Friday night. I'm thinking about the date. Is it August? Oh my gosh. August the 28th. That's amazing. Friday night, August the 28th. 2020. So tonight's philosophy and theory chit chat, I'm going to talk about really specifically the earth and water phases. So last week I was talking about how we're going to start moving through the phase relationships. And I was going to discuss what I mean, like not so much by the phases, but what my interpretation of the relationships are, some keywords and some descriptors around those, and then how they might play out in a martial arts setting. So everyone, if you've just been joining, welcome. So the way that we're thinking about phases and movements from last week, talking about fire and water, I was presenting that in terms of martial arts, style, movements, different ways of responding emotionally, mentally to situations and circumstances. And we can do the same thing. So the different phases we're just talking about water and fire and how they are very useful in very certain circumstances. So fire is very forward moving and very around consuming. Water is always very quick to give it space. Oops, sorry, moving away. And then we rotate to different phases, not better or worse, just different experiences that could be played out. And then we start talking about earth and wind. So earth phase, which is really interesting, is really geometrically based. You can see that in the form and the structure. And earth is all about standing ground, but not in an aggressive way. You know, sometimes we talk about like standing my ground, and as if it's like you have to fight to stand your ground. When you think about the mountains, they're just there. They're just hanging out, doing their thing. And if you're, in an airplane and you're foolish enough to get too close to the mountain, whose fault is it that the plane crashed into the mountain? The mountain was just hanging out there. So it's important to draw this distinction between like aggressively defending, which is not an earthy response, and just kind of being there anyway, So some examples of really earthy movements in martial arts are things like the natural fighting stances where the feet are out in a triangle shape. And if you think about how structures are sound and a mountain, there's a triangle kind of relationship going on there. So if you had a mountain that was only 1 meter wide and 300 meters tall, would we still call it a mountain, or would we just call it a wall? And would it be particularly weak? Would it actually exhibit any of the qualities that we consider the mountain would exhibit? So as people, when we're moving ourselves in martial arts physically, we create these triangle structures. And I talk heaps about triangle structures in the earth phase. Triangles with the legs, and then how that supports the form, and triangles with the hands, and relating to whatever it is that's the attack or the aggress. So earth, if we come up with keywords for earth, we could say things like stable, structured, strong, solid, solidifying. I'm thinking just more keywords and terms. Stabilizing, maybe. It's kind of like dense. It's got this density to it. And so the earth manifestations, maybe in character, could be, they would tend to be things like a really solid sense of self. There's quite a strength of, I say of character, but a strength of resolve with earthy kind of styles and manifestations of character. If we look at the oppositional phase to earth, we jump across to wind. The wind phase, again, it's like the total opposite. It has this totally different relationship. So wind is all about being ever moving, never finds a point of stability. It's always getting flipped up, at any moment. The smallest movement sets off a chain reaction. And it's hard to pin down and hard to really get a handle on wind, because of the fact that it lacks any structure of its own, and it's entirely kind of at the whim, and it doesn't even necessarily have a goal. Whereas we talk about fire phase lacking structure, but it also has goals. Its goals are to burn things. Its goals are to consume the fuel that's in front of it. Whereas wind doesn't particularly have a self-motivated goal. You know, if you think about how wind manifests, it's just this free-forming, responsive movement that might be being put into play by other forces and factors. So, you know, global winds, other forms of heating and cooling and large-scale systems, but it's not the wind itself. We're not like, oh, that wind, that vicious wind that once it's out to get me. The wind is just kind of doing its thing, and you're caught up for the ride, but it's never really feels particularly personal. So these two, when we look at them in martial arts, or maybe actually before I get to that, I'll further detail wind. So in martial arts, the windy motion moves across the north and south line, which is exactly the same as the earth experience. So the wind is about contraction and expansion. If you had a spring and you pushed it in, you considered that the attacker was getting closer to the defender, to the responder, then this contraction and this spring relationship that's happening with wind, that is generating part of the power that wind will use to respond. And then conversely, if wind sort of distances itself away, it expands and it vacuums. It creates like either a compression or a vacuum. Again, you're prepping wind for something. So wind moves north to south. It's very linear. It gets very caught up because of that. So terrible idea if you're getting backed against a wall, but great idea if you're able to move with that. And a lot of the wind kata that we have in the style movements, like from being grabbed or attacked or punched or throat grabs, whatever, it moves at a different tempo, at a different speed to the attacker. You know, faster away, closer in, etc. So the whole idea of wind is about manipulating the contraction and expansion between two objects. And Earth is moving east and west. It's not really interested at all in moving further towards something or further away from it. It's just there. It's just doing its thing. And it's like, hey, I'm just a mountain. I'm just doing my mountaineering thing. And good luck to you, little airplane. You do whatever you want, but I'm just here being a mountain, you know. So I find that earth and wind kind of have this really, not this nonchalant attitude, but it's very relaxed. And maybe that's not quite the right term, but they're, don't get me wrong, they can be quite effective and rather vicious, but they themselves aren't motivated by winning. You know, it isn't that the mountain's going to win over the aeroplane. The mountain was just there. It isn't necessarily that the wind is planning to erode you from all angles. The wind is just moving and bouncing and moved because of its nature from other motivators. So the two of them are kind of very externally motivated and externally responsive, and we see that in the techniques, in the ways that they move. They don't really do anything until there's an input. So fire could just walk towards someone and attack them. Yeah, old school, a couple of really fun old school samurai arts where it's not defensive at all. The whole technique is you walk towards someone and stab them. You think, well, where's the self-defense? You know, walk towards someone and grab them and throw them over your leg. And you're like, oh, it's not, I get it. Those schools aren't about defense. They're about just getting the upper hand and, you know, offense. So if we talk about how it is that wind and earth, what they do to people, how they manifest as character traits. If you imagine an individual who is kind of constantly face changing, always seemingly ahead of the argument, you know. So I'm a Gemini, and we've been told that Geminis do this really annoying thing in conversation: present a topic, during the conversation, rethink the position on a topic, and then re-enter from a completely different opinion or a different angle or perspective of the same opinion, sometimes completely contrary to where you started the conversation. And it's confusing for the other person, or I get the other person can't find a point of stability in that. So some of the keywords for wind are things like confusing, disorienting, subversive, distracting, but maybe less so. Vacuous, contracting, spring-like. It's movement. It's non-structural. It's unstable. So you have these terms for wind, and you can start to get a picture in your mind of how the wind movements might feel, how they might come about. The taijutsu of wind might really have this bouncy, light, up and down, flowy relationship, and you can get that from the keywords. Whereas the taijutsu of earth is pretty solid. If you're going to create a triangle and just be there, your triangle's going to have to be pretty strong. You can't have a strong triangle if you're jumping about all the time. Doesn't mean that stability is the correct, great, best way of being. So one of the things I didn't mention last week, but I'll get into in tonight's video, is that we've got character traits and qualities, manifestations, or qualitative manifestations in each of the phases, which are maybe generative or helpful, but it's also got negative attributes. So, for example, if we take what would be a really positive attribute for Earth called stability and structure, that really quickly turns into rigidity and inertia. So it's like it's a fine line between whether the mountain is solid and strong or rigid and immobile. And that line just depends on the perspective, because the mountain's just there. And so the wind is either free and moving and spontaneous, or it's scattered and unhinged and unstable. So you're kind of like, it's not that any one of them is right or wrong. So in dealing with each other, the way that they negate each other, you've got earth just standing there, and then you've got wind trying to draw people into the bait and the drama, So wind's like, ooh, but nothing really happens and earth doesn't go anywhere. Or wind rushes forward, to compress that space, but earth doesn't really flinch or move and nothing really happens. And so it's almost like wind is trying to throw this little fishing hook out with a carrot and bait the partner or the opposition into response, either draw them into your evil plot or scare them because it's rushing forward towards them. And the individual that just is unmoved by that isn't affected by wind. And so the two in the kata, they negate each other. If you can remember how it is that wind and earth kata move, if we've got one of the individuals, would be fun we'll get back onto this when we're back in the dojo on the mats. One of the individuals to be really drawing, in a windy motion and starting the wind kata, this big vacuous drawing, and the earth responder is just moving on the spot, east and west, not north and south, and just creating triangles and structures. And it's like, wind doesn't have anything to work with unless it's drawn the person off balance. And if it rushes back in, earth just is still standing there. It's like nothing really happens. It's kind of like two really awkward people in a room, trying to ask each other out, but no one ever gets the head up. And then after 40 years, they still haven't done anything about it, just kind of standing there waiting for someone else to do something. So terrible relationship idea, by the way. So in that idea, what I'm first of all talking about are the relationships in the opposition, and then I'll talk later, maybe in the next couple of videos, maybe now, I'll see what I want to do, about the angles of relationships, because something that I get really excited by in Hoshin is we've got these 3 layers. So there's 12 phases. There's 4 phases in each. We divide them into 3 categories, and I call them the primary, secondary, and tertiary phases. And they oppose and relate each other. So for example, in the primary phase, we've got the 4 fundamental elements. So we've got earth, fire, air, and water. And we've got the relationship between water and fire as a oppositional relationship. We've got the relationship between earth and wind as an oppositional relationship. But if you can imagine a big circle and and a north, south, east, west compass. And if you plot these 4 onto the compass, what you immediately realize is that they also are at 90-degree right angles to each other. And so you've got not only this direct opposition, like on a seesaw, opposite ends of a stick, you've also got the thing that goes off the dogleg at a left angle. So what can become really exciting in martial arts is say, oh, okay, there's the relationship between earth and wind, that's quite known, but what about the relationship between earth and water, or the relationship between earth and fire? And so those are adjunctive, those are like adjacent relationships, these 90-degree angles. And if you just keep that in your mind as one little wheel, and then there's a second layer, the secondary phases, it's just another 4 phases. So then the secondary phases, we've got things like metal, mist, clay, and lightning. Well, they are also in this little north, south, east, west compass. Some of them are opposing each other, some of them are adjacent to each other and the relationships. And then there's a third, actually, so before that, so that in that setting, it's clay and lightning are the oppositionals, and metal and mist are the oppositionals. And then on the third layer, we've got another one of these little wheels that kind of sit on top. And it's the tertiary phases and their relationships. So we've got phosphor, thunder, tar, and fog. And they're like, we've got direct 180-degree oppositions, and we've got 90-degree adjacent relationships. If you take the 3 layers of those and you kind of sit them onto each other, you end up with this 12-spoked wheel. And each of the phases, each phase is about 30 degrees apart in a circle. And you take your 360-degree circle, and you've got 12 individual points, and you get about 30-degree angles between these things. So then you can ask further questions. You can say, what's the relationship between earth and fire, which would be a big 90-degree relationship? What's the relationship between earth and phosphor? You're like, oh, well, maybe that's only a 60-degree relationship. What's the relationship between earth and metal? You're like, oh, that's only a 30-degree relationship. And so you've got this broader rainbow spectrum of how things could play out. It's not so black and white as just, I jumped up, they jumped down, I moved forward, they walked backwards, Before you get into playing with that and exploring that in the dojo, in taijutsu, the first thing you want to look at are the oppositionals, because you need to be able to just pretty quickly have an understanding of how earth and wind relate and how that dynamic plays out before you move on to the 90-degree angles, before you look at like, okay, well, what does earth and fire do, or what are earth and water, and way before you're like, what is earth and clay and phosphor? That starts doing your head in. So if you were training these, and I know that I haven't done it yet this week, but I will be taking video. I'll put up videos. I'll get down to the dojo maybe during next week and film myself doing the kata, just the base introductory kata, and then I'll present that so you can have something to continue moving through at home. So maybe your taijutsu, your qigong. And an interesting question would be like, what are the feelings? What's being evoked? Because the purpose of the kata is not teaching you self-defense. Don't ever make that mistake. Like, the kata is entirely designed to help you learn about the qualities of a particular phase and to remember and evoke how that movement should feel. That's the goal of the kata, yeah. And then you turn it into self-defense yourself. That's what you have to do. Then you turn it into the techniques and you have some fun with it. But the purpose of the kata is just to give you an opportunity to have a chat with fire, or have a chat with wind, or sit down and have a cup of tea with clay. That's the idea, so that in your own mind, in your own heart, you're dialoguing with these archetypal attributes, and we're stepping back. We're not even naming them like, character traits of humans. It's not like, oh, that's selfishness, that's egomania. So we're not naming them human characteristics, but just to have a dialogue with retreating and flow, or to have a dialogue with aggressive, forward-moving quality, or to have a dialogue with really solid, long-term confidence, like the mountain. And as we dialogue with those aspects of ourselves, sure enough, those aspects, we tend to develop a better relationship with them. We find it easier to re-evoke them, So all of a sudden, if we're, I don't know, walking down the street and someone comes up and gives us a piece of their mind, I don't know how often that happens to you. Maybe I'm just living in the wrong part of town. That suddenly it's like, you're like, oh, wait a minute, I've dialogued with you before. Imaginary human person who's just exhibiting kind of a manifestation of a particular group of qualities. I know you, you could be like, yeah, you say your name's Bob, but I'm going to call you Wind. And then you're like, I know what that relationship's like. I know what that dialogue is like. And I know what this is like in a martial arts setting. I've played with that. I have a feel of how I would best respond to that. Maybe I could do that verbally. Maybe I could do that emotionally or mentally. Maybe that could come about. Maybe I can dance with that. And I could be like, you're Bob. Did I call him Bob or Bill? I can't remember. You're Bob, but I'm going to call you Mr. Wind for this little altercation on the street. And so I'm going to know a few things about you. I'm going to know straight away that if I throw something into the middle of you, you'll vanish because you don't have any substance. I know that if I really just run head on into the argument directly, and I really stick ultimately to one line topic, you won't be able to maintain the argument with me because you don't have any central agenda. You're all wispy-wishy. And then don't get me wrong, Bob might suddenly change and be like, oh, now I call him Mr. Fire. But you start to realize that you can categorize these relationships with other people, and you're like, oh, I see what that is. And it might change halfway through the conversation, and then you just catch how that changes. And then you align your own response to that. I'll say it's really important. This isn't meant to suggest that you walk around town manipulating people. It's not that you walk around town categorizing, the entire human race towards how you can best take advantage of them or anything like that. Because the motives will undermine you. Like you'll be undermined by your own lack of integrity. If you consider something like the earthy concept, and I know some people like this, they really just wander through their life very solid in their own position, their own opinions. My experiences with them, they don't particularly seek out to be the leader of some new great political movement. They're not seeking members of their following death cult or anything. They're just kind of quite content, even if they were the only people in the world who held a particular belief or an idea or whatever it is. They just kind of chip along, and they have this strange sense of confidence, it's not gained through them deconstructing someone else's opinion. They're just kind of like, oh man, whatever, that's great, man. I'm doing my thing, you do your thing. And so it's a really different way of moving about the world. If they had this hidden agenda to them that was this very fiery agenda, it's like, I'm gonna gather people on side and consume things and undermine a system from the outside, that their agenda betrays them automatically, because they couldn't help but to manifest qualities or take action in ways that would demonstrate their actual intent. Whereas you could look at that and you could be like, well, when was the last time that the mountain, rallied up a whole storm of troops to go and attack the fox in the den? If the mountain suddenly, if the flame puts on the little mask of a mountain and goes and parades as a mountain and starts pretending that, as a mountain, this is all about solidness and structure and defense, and that's why we have to kill these people. It's like automatically they've accidentally given a hint away that they're just pretending, you know. And so as these phases move in and out, they don't just manifest with individuals' character traits, but also entire moral guide, you know, so that the particular values and what would be classed as virtuous from the earthy perspective are completely different to the values and what is classed as virtuous for the fiery perspective, you know, because for the fiery perspective, to just be still and stagnant and solid and unmoving means to die. So the whole movement of fire, the whole motivation of fire is away from that point. And there's never a single moment where fire is acquiescing to stagnant, you know, or to its stagnation, to its solidness. So fire doesn't see strength and structure and solidity as a virtue. Fire sees it as a threat, yeah, or an opposition. But that's only in relationship to fire. Earth's probably quite happy just farming crops on the mountainside. And so you get into these problems where, depending on the particular type of colored glasses that you're wearing, the interpretation of the world and the world's events and other people's events categorize into good or bad or right or wrong, but they're all from the perspective of a particular value system. And it's worth just noting that, you know, before you ride into battle towards anyone, what it is that is your underlying motivator. And, you know, for good or bad. So moving on from that particular topic, although I do get quite excited about those kinds of discussions, on a really practical level, in martial arts settings, in Hoshin originally, Glenn put forward he had the four primary elements in his Hoshin Jutaijutsu. So he had earth, water, fire, and wind. And the way he designed his curriculum, he taught them by belt grade. So you had like the earth belt. So the red belt was all earth techniques. Essays on earthy qualities. You had to read books that were demonstrations of like military strategy from feudal Japan, and philosophies that were like earth demonstrations, slow and steady wins the race, stable footings, all these concepts. You had to be able to write essays. Hey, consider yourselves lucky until you get to black belt. You have to write essays where you've read one of the books. This is like from white belt to red belt. You've read one of the books. So you've read the Goryeo, you read the Book of Five Rings, and then you present an essay discussing why Miyamoto Musashi made those decisions in his fight against such and such. And it's until you finish that whole topic of understanding, you're not allowed to move on to the next belt grade, and then the next belt grade. You know, so red belt is the earth belt, and then orange belt was the water belt. Same thing, different techniques, totally different techniques, different manifestations of ideas, different books to be read, different philosophies at heart. Still writing essays and writing, you know, responses, call and answer question responses, but suddenly it's like what you're vilifying are a completely different set of values and principles. And then again, you move on to yellow belt, which was the fire study. And then you move on to green belt, which was the wind study. And that was it. That was as far as his grading system went. After green belt, it was Shodan. And he had a blue belt in there, which was an honorary belt, which was a belt that he bestowed as a rank to demonstrate an individual who's undertaken incredible personal growth and emotional and personal spiritual development. So the blue belt wasn't really a part of his curriculum, like a grading curriculum as such, as a special reward or acknowledgement. So he only had 4 belts, but each of those, and 4 grades, each of those layers themselves was like one of our phases, you know. When I changed that around with the Rain Spirit Dojo, long after, because that kind of got shifted first by my teachers, and then I shifted it again into this method that we have, where it's like, well, the studies of the phase are going to have techniques that roll through increasing complexity. but we're not going to suddenly forget them or move on from them, you know, because from my perception, once you have finished the red belt study, you know, you've moved on from Earth. My experience was with my peers, a lot of people then took that to mean that Earth was kind of done. They ticked that off, you know, and that ways of moving in an earthy quality were of lower importance than the next one, or were you know, only beginners need to move like that. But now I can move like watery because I'm so much better. And there was this like competing limit, so that eventually you'd end up in some high position, and you kind of account that, oh, you know, the beginners back there studying Earth, the beginners back there studying water, you know, not like me, I'm floating through trees, you know. And I thought it really painted the wrong picture. It's not, I don't believe that's what Glenn was aiming to put across, you know. And so I changed the curriculum in the way that we have it, so that it wasn't a stack of study. It was a spread, like a horizontal spread of study. And we had to explore techniques and philosophy from beginner level to advanced level in each of these columns, rather than these rows. And then we just loop and cycle. I really wanted to make it very obvious to everyone studying Hoshinden that none of the phases' qualities are better or worse than any other phase. It's just that sometimes they're inappropriate. So you might have chosen just the completely inefficient way of responding to something, you know. But it's not because they had the correct one. It's just that you misunderstood, or you chose, or that you were a victim of only one way of being, you know, and you just couldn't change. You were just Earth man, and it didn't matter what happened, no matter what you did, you couldn't be anything other. Yeah. So that kind of the ways that plays out in character traits for humans, I think, is something that's always fascinated me. And the big wheel, the 12-spoke wheel, the dojo, you know, can also be seen as like a character map for human behavior. So it's categorizing certain behaviors, and sure, it's not foolproof, but it's categorizing certain behaviors into the manifestations of their qualities. So that, and I don't just mean like, you know, anger. What I mean is the method and the motivation that underpins behavior. So for example, if someone's angry, great. But if they express that anger towards getting their outcome, and it's like they just cut straight through to the points of people, burst in through the front door at the bank, kick the door down, you know, rip the vault open. Well, it's like, well, that anger is being expressed in a really metallic, really like solid metallic forward moving structure. If that person's super angry but really subversive, and it's all about, they'll never just go straight in and tell someone what they think, but they're always constantly criticizing, constantly undermining other individuals from the outside, you know, pitting their friends against them. We're like, oh, that anger is just being manifested through a really fiery, maybe even a fiery, watery character manifestation. So don't make the mistake of categorizing the emotions themselves into particular qualities or phases. It's more about human archetype, how it is that we express ourselves. And then all of us, we fall into particular categories. So, you know, there's just certain ways of being that you'll feel more comfortable with than others. And that'll be a product of your biology, and including a combination of your upbringing and the social situation where you were raised at the time, the family situation, how you inherited your parents' morals and value structures and belief system, your own experiences, and how they've, you know, as you've grown and developed and things haven't quite gone to plan, you know, and you've had to review those. All of that goes into the soup that makes up, you know, us as an individual. And so these qualities, these phases are like, okay, there'll be certain phases and attributes that you really, really dig. I love wind and water and fire. I'm all up for you know, sending in petitions rather than kicking down the front door of the bank. It's just my character. But something that I've really had to learn over the decades is to have the ability to kick the door down if I need to have the ability to actually stand in that earthy sort of sense and let the plane just crash if I need to. And I found that through that, like the largest reticence that I've had are towards all the areas that I need to work on most. When I started, like I just thought that there was nothing worse in the world than the earth study. Stupid waste of my time, like completely pointless waste of my time. Because here I was, I could just cartwheel over people and flip around them, and I could just be constantly on the move. And after years and years of doing that, you start to realize that you're just eroding yourself. Can't build anything, can't build structures or wealth or family, or they can't build stability. And so eventually it's like, oh, maybe I'll give these earth concepts a bit of a second look, because suddenly they have something in them that I want. It's funny how it doesn't, that's what it takes. So when we're studying them, it's important to remember that there's always going to be particular flavors that we are naturally attracted to, that we're like, yeah, I get that, feels great. I love those techniques. They feel so cool. I really understand the philosophies, all of the values of that way of being, fully aligned with my opinions. And we tick them off as that's the correct one because I'm right. So therefore anything that anything agrees with me must also be right. Yeah. And then when we come up to something where we're like, oh, it feels so uncomfortable, I don't like it. All the people who are involved in this are just pig-headed, stupid, brute idiots. If we start getting that kind of dialogue in our head, what we've probably touched on is an area that's going to be really important for us to practice. We've probably stumbled upon a whole character trait or manifestation of quality that we are just not innately good at, and we don't understand at all, and we hide and we shy away. We pretend, rather than, well, because maybe when in that hypothetical example, because that person isn't maybe inclined towards tackling things head on, they won't tackle their criticisms head on either. They'll come up with justifications. Be like, yeah, well, I would become the super kick-ass plumber football rock star. I could if I wanted to, but I don't because, because I have all these opinions about it. And it's just a subversive way of, again, cheating ourselves from the actual study of being like, wow, what are the qualities of going out and playing football in winter in the rain? Like, what does that do to someone in your character? It obviously builds something. And there's a reason why we say, oh, well, people who've been doing that for 30 years all kind of have a certain character. The people who've all been, top corporate CEOs for 20 or 30 years, they all have a certain type of character. All the people who are, I'm trying to think of certain weird categories that I can build around that. I was going to say friends of mine who are all like super high level, multi-PhD academics who have become perpetual students, eternal students. They all have a very certain type of intellectualism in their character. Like there's a manifestation. Yeah, and then Hannah says musicians. So it's like what we do is over time, we start to conglomerate in these little groups, because obviously, again, I'm right. So everyone who agrees with me must be right. Yeah. And then we gather and we get together like that. The disaster is that we might build up enough of us that we can keep out anyone else. That's a terrible shame, because then it's over. Like there's no development, there's no growth. Then you just, for example, I would only become a victim of wind equality, and then that's just it. Whereas what I've actually needed is earthy qualities, fiery and clay-like qualities. And those of you who I've thrown around in class, I love clay. Like I so get into that. Wow. And I really love earth. I've over the years, I've shown myself how to embody those qualities. And then I've noticed, I've been in the middle of a conversation with someone, some issue, whatever. and I've suddenly noticed that I'm responding or behaving in a way verbally that's really strong not aggressive, just really strong, really solid. You know, I'm just standing my ground, but I'm not aggressing about it. And it's like, I suddenly realized, while this other person's, you know, making their rebuttal, I suddenly realized that I'm doing the thing that I sucked at 20 years ago. And I think, when did I learn this? You know, and I go back and I'm like, oh, wait, I've been learning this all along. I've been slowly studying the structure of that physically. And then I've been able to slowly convert that into a structure mentally and emotionally. So I'm just going to check the time for a sec, because I get a little bit carried away. Oh, 8. I'm glad I checked. There's like 10 minutes left. Okay. So looping back to the discussion about wind and earth. On a martial arts setting, earth tends to move very east and west. So its interest is in just maintaining its position that it already had. So if it strikes, it just strikes at, like, out to the distance that it already controls. It doesn't reach out, you know. It's not tipping over its front feet trying to punch something. It waits for the right timing and then it elbows the individual, you know, or it waits for the right timing and then it strikes, but it doesn't actually have to move from its little pod, because that's where all of its strength is. Ed, one of my old teachers, he used to have this killer elbow. Like he'd say, okay, I can't do his accent. He was a Pennsylvanian American, kind of crossed with the Texas Ranger. I can't do his accent at all, but he would just kind of be like, okay, come at me. I'm not even going to bother doing his accent. Come at me, come grab my throat. You walk in, and he'd just be like, he'd fumble, and then he'd go to reach for his wallet, and then your lip would be bleeding, because he'd grab his wallet and he'd be combing his hair, and he'd just take you out with his elbow. It was sweet. Yeah, Jujitsu, he used to call it, old man skills. Really cool. But he used to tell me stories about how that's not how he used to move when he was 50 or 60. It's like he developed into that over time as his opportunity constricted. So he had issues. He had like 2 metal hips and a whole bunch of medical problems and arthritis issues. So he said that over the years, and you can see this when you look at people like Hatsumi Soke, they've drastically changed the way that they present, but that they haven't lost any of their efficiency. They might have changed because heading straight in, like a wrecking ball, might have worked at a certain time in their life for their body type and their body structure, but then they couldn't get the same results anymore at a particular point in time, and so they slowly shift. And I think that's how they're able to actually maintain their terrifying efficiency. Like how it is that Hatsumi Soke at age 90 was still able to just crush people to the ground. But you go back and watch videos of him in the 80s, and he's literally throwing people over and then cartwheeling over their head with his hand. Like takes them, uses their head, pushes their head into the ground as the press-off point to do a cartwheel over. And you're like, okay, whoa. And then now he doesn't do that. He's not cartwheeling. He's not like, he's amazing, yes, but he's not a 90-year-old who's like jumping up, grabbing the head of someone and backflipping off them. But he's still brutally effective, probably more so. But now it's turned into like controlling the structure. Lots of these vicious little grabs, so reaches out and Shakoken grabs around the face, or grabs control of the back of the neck or the ribs, gets his fingers up under the ribs. That sucks. Sword, all of his mutadori, his empty hand sword work, so like grabbing the sword. And, we might try to lever, like imagine if someone attacks with a baseball bat, some of our Hambo defense stuff. And we go, okay, you get in, you take control, and then you start levering the weapon out of their hand. He doesn't bother levering, he just crushes the fingers. Like he just takes the thumb and dislocates your thumb in the position where it's holding onto the stick. It has the same effect. You can't hold onto the stick. And so obviously he's had to adapt and adjust. And part of the map, like the maps system in terms of the phases, what I mean is part of the use of the phases as a map, as a projection, that's the word I'm looking for, is that it can offer I think it can offer some insight into how it is that people do that. How it is that you go, okay, I can see that at one point in time, these were the qualities that this person was really exhibiting. And then slowly they shifted through the spectrum for whatever reason, health or injuries or their own change of values or ideology, and they shifted to a different kind of presentation. And the map, as like a clock, is just meant to represent possible options for human quality, for archetypal manifestation. It doesn't say that any of them are good or bad, or that any of them are the right way or the wrong way. You're the one who has to make those decisions. Like, it's in the moment of applying them that suddenly they become right and wrong. Until that moment, there's no arbitration. Nothing's wrong until you are committing a crime against your own value systems. And then you're immediately wrong, no matter what the motivation is, yeah? It's like, doesn't matter what your thoughts were about the world before that. At the point of you suddenly make this decision, the questions are like, what was the motivation? What were the intentions of that decision? Did you think that you were making decisions for your own best interests or the best interests of others? And even if you answer this question, you say, yep, and I absolutely did. It was directly in line with my values and all of my beliefs, and I took action and I feel completely at one and aligned. Even then, it might have terrible consequences that you couldn't even conceive of, So it's not enough to judge whether things are, right or wrong or good or bad. It's all incredibly circumstantial. But I do think that this kind of study can help us just get a bit of a grasp on what the options are. And maybe if we've been trying something 2 or 3 times, I think I mentioned this back in March as one of the last sessions we had. It's like, if you've been trying something multiple times and failing repeatedly, again and again and again, or you respond in the exact same way to 20 different people who all, so there's like someone who's, I don't know, someone's bullying you in a particular way, and you respond and it doesn't really change anything, but they go away. And then another person appears who bullies you in the same way, and you respond in the same way you did before, and nothing really happens, but eventually they die. And then a third person comes and you're like, well, it's obviously not working. I think when you have to wait for life to kill people so that they'll get out of your hair, it's probably time to review what your approach is. It obviously means that you're missing something. There's something that you haven't seen. Yeah. Wrapping that up on a practical level, if you're practicing this in a martial arts setting with others, when we're back in the dojo, I highly recommend, sparring, or even if you're doing techniques, if you're the uke, for example, or if you're the one who's actually, say, like throwing that punch, see if you can draw up an actual quality. See if you can be like, okay, I'm not just some puppet who's standing here putting my arm out for this other person to grab and throw around. I'm dynamic, I'm alive, I'm learning something. What happens if I punch? I'm just going to punch with a fiery agenda. I'm super like fiery. And you're like, oh, and you'll notice it completely changes the way that you behave, and it will completely change the way that your partner has to respond. And they can still do the same technique, but you can explore, you can write it down in a little black book, and you can be like, Billy doesn't do well against watery people. And then when, they jump up to be your sparring partners for your black belt exam, you've got your little black book and you're like, right, Billy, water, Jonathan, fire, Samantha, earth, and you know how to take them all out. Anyway, I reckon what we'll do is I'll just leave that at that point in that discussion. After our Zoom social hangout last week, which was really fun for those who were here, that was great fun, guys. Rory's done a kick-ass job suddenly throwing up videos and his fitness videos on the page. So if you haven't seen those, just scroll back through the Facebook page. That's awesome. Thanks for it. Reeve has promised me that he's going to do some video recording of the kata. So he's going to get geared up and actually do some recording of him, almost like a Tai Chi form. I've asked him to do water and fire kata. And then now that we've talked about earth and wind, I'll ask him to do that and put it up on the page. And Stephen Leaford offered us a core workout, Ab Blaster 2000 video, which will be awesome because I'm loving my abs. But that hasn't happened yet. So I'm like, Stephen, any day now would be great, man. I hope that you guys are well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish the recording because this particular part, this will go up on the Facebook page and the YouTube page as reference. For those of you who need to head off, I hope you have an awesome night and weekend. If you'd like to stick around and stay and we can chit chat and try out, social hangout, I'll finish the recording and then we can talk. So for everyone else at internet land at home, if you're watching this in 200 years from now, if that exists, have fun and I'll see you next week. All the best.